He wasn't in the labour market, your husband is, you were getting universal credit in your family, you now go out to work, you get some income, your benefits get cut a lot. The kind of implicit tax rate, it is much, much higher than anything that the richest people in the country pay. Invest in social infrastructure, which Diana is going to talk about later. Publish this kind of equality impact assessments that we've done. Base local government funding on need rather than arbitrary cuts. But how do you secure those kind of changes? So that's the final thing I wanted to end on. The kind of political coalitions that are necessary to bring about changes that reduce the kind of unequal impacts that we see of these policies. And from what I'm seeing, it's easier to get support for more investment in social infrastructure, in education, in health, than it is to get for more investment in social security. Indicate the Labour Party manifesto at the last election was full of promises about improving funding for the health service and for schools. It said nothing about rolling back the cuts to the social security system. So I think if we're talking about justice for all, it's clearly the people who are living these multiple disadvantages of class, gender and race who are not getting justice, but to get the kind of political coalition that will reverse that, I think, is more difficult than when it comes to changes in the social security benefits than when it comes to spending more money on services that the middle classes use. So I just have to think about the challenges of trying to tackle this issue of justice for all, thinking about these intersections of class, gender and race.
Thank you, Diana. Very interesting configurations of the numbers. We do have some time for questions, about 7 minutes, and I'd like to take questions in pairs if that works out. It may not work. So, questions, folks. A question over there. Do I see another question in the room? Not yet? Okay, go ahead.
I'm Tom Schuller, and I should make it clear, I'm not a gender expert at all. I just want to say one thing. I've had 2 spells inside the OECD prison, one in the 1970s and one in the noughties. And I'm not defending OECD, as it were, but I would say even in the 1970s there was a lot of conversation about inequalities there, particularly the education director that I worked in, but even amongst employment. And I think one of the issues around this kind of international data is a lot of it depends on the interaction. And the more people like yourself and so on make use of particular data and ask for particular data and push for particular data, the more OECD will respond. But in a policy sense, inequalities, I think, are actually, there is a response element there too. My question was about, you bracketed together revaluing women's work in public sector employment. And I just wanted to ask, I think I can see why you do that, but isn't the worst pay problems for lower paid women are in the private sector rather than the public sector? And there's a sort of risk, I think, of public sector employment good and feminized, and private sector, I mean, I know you had the minimum wage in there, but I wonder if you thought that was an issue at all.
I missed seeing a hand just behind me here, so I'd like you to ask your question, please.
I'm Diana.
To come up here.
Sorry.
Should be all right.
Can you hear? Can you hear? It was just really about whether, again relating to the OECD study, whether, although you're dealing with, presumably the data also has international comparisons, but I just got a kind of implicit national sense within the way in which it was being discussed, and I was wondering whether you could make it more international. I'm thinking of your recommendations, for example. I mean, clearly, in raising minimum wages, has implications, and so thinking about this in a more global context, and also bringing in notions of uneven development a bit more, recognising the ways in which those high-income households depend a lot often on migrant care workers, for example, and how low-income workers, or everyone, their conditions are made possible by the very low wages in export platforms and things like that. I'm always struck by Adam Smith's remark that the basic thing, a working man, I mean, we didn't think about working women, but Adam Smith talked about the working man was a pair of leather breeches and a silk shirt. Well, our clothes cost so much less nowadays, partly because of the technologies, but partly because of the, extremely low wages in some parts of the world. So I wondered if you could give it a more international flavour, recognising what that would mean for your recommendations a bit.
Really good points. I think I bracketed the revaluing women's work and the public sector employment because there's more powerful levers in the public sector, I think, for getting that revaluing brought about, which is not to say that it should also happen in the private sector. I'm just sceptical about whether this strategy of saying that the private sector companies must publish audits of their gender pay gaps is actually going to address this kind of issue, because it will address the issue of gender pay gaps between highly paid lawyers, for instance, and financial sector people, but I'm not sure that it will address that revaluation. So I do think there should be a revaluation in the private sector too, and there is some leverage in some legal leverage for this, I think, in the way that equal opportunities law is framed when you've got like in local government, the one employer employing both the dinner ladies and the refuse bin collectors. The lawyers among you will know better than me as to how much purchase that's got on companies which only employ care workers, for instance, and other companies which only employ building workers. Have we got any mechanism for getting those companies which employ care workers to move up the wages that they pay in the way that we do have some levers, I think, now, coming from some important legal cases in the public sector. But I don't disagree with you that there needs to be that revaluation, and I think that's that issue. You can't just have more women in the labour market if they're only earning tiny amount. That's not going to solve the problems. I agree absolutely with what Diane said about I thought if I'm going to do both these studies, I'm not going to have time to elaborate more on what the international context is needed. But I do sit on a UN Committee for Development Policy, which pays a lot of attention to what's the global enabling environment for those kinds of policies that I was recommending. And yes, I absolutely agree. To change the way that the international financial system is regulated, you have to address things like tax havens. There's a lot of things that have to be done in terms of the international economic system to make it more possible. But it's not impossible. Countries have raised the minimum wage, for instance, without disaster happening.
I see two more questions. I also smell the cake. So if I could ask you just to keep your questions quite short and crisp.
One more person this side.
Keep your questions really short and crisp, and then Diane will have a brief chance to respond. I saw Barbara's, I saw Thalia, and I saw Tony over here. So go for it, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Diane. The slides were incredibly powerful. The first slide that you showed, where you'd calculated the difference, the impact makes of social security and tax reforms from 2010 to 2020 on women as well as men, showing that the poorest suffered more than the other classes. And you said, you actually said that the government didn't know this when they devised these policies because the government didn't do the analysis. Now, most left-wing critics of this government would say that that was deliberate. So my question is simply what kind of analysis they did do in order to bring about a series of social security and tax reforms which have this devastating and systematic impact.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yes, I'm Thalia Kidder. I'm wondering about the race dimension and would be glad to know if you know of, on the race dimension, are there countries in the OECD that have either done analysis or done policies that don't have so much racial inequality in their outcomes?
Thank you. It seems very precarious to be a parent from your slide. So really what we're looking at is women of a certain age where there's an impact, and then presumably also young children bearing the brunt of those inequalities. So I just think there are threads there, not necessarily to respond to now, but that will be picked up during the next 24 hours.
Yeah. Is that the questions? Did you? No more questions from you? No, you're okay. Okay. Thank you.
The government did start in 2010 publishing alongside, as the UK government, alongside the budget, what it called a distributional analysis but it did it by household, quintile and decile. And there was an ongoing dispute, with everybody else about whether they had done this appropriately, because of course they also always tried to present it in a way that tried to show that actually we are all in this together. But they only did that because they included in it some of the policies of the previous government, the Labour government, which had raised taxes for the richest. And therefore the analysis that the Institute of Fiscal Studies always produced was always different and showed a worse distributional impact of the government. So what did the government do actually when George Osborne became Chancellor? They just stopped doing that kind of distributional, publishing that kind of distribution.